Or be on the outside. I don't know. We'll see nice people.
All right. You want this over here? Okay. All right.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. We've got a bigger crowd than we typically have for committee meetings, and so I appreciate everyone's willingness and desire to engage with the topic of housing in our city. We're holding a joint committee meeting to discuss good cause eviction. Governor Kathy Hochul signed into law good cause eviction on April 20th, 2024. Part of that state legislation requires municipalities to opt into the state good cause eviction law through the process of passing a local law. We have had the local law introduced by myself, Councilor Williams, Councilor Monto, Councilor Jones-Rouser, and Councilor Paniagua. And today we are having the first of many committee meetings to talk about good cause eviction and how it may impact our city. We are going to invite a variety of stakeholders with different perspectives to come join us in the council chambers and share their opinion and their perspective on housing within the community and what part good cause eviction may play in that. I'm joined today by Councilor Hogan, Councilor Jones-Rouser, Councilor Nave, and Monto. And sitting at the table with us are representatives from CNY Fair Housing. Before we start today, I'm going to mention that our guests today are representatives from CNY Fair Housing. They will be our only guests for today, and there will be no public comment in our meeting. And so with that, I will ask you all to introduce yourselves and provide an opening statement.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. I'm not so surprised to see a lot of interest in this. I'm Sally Santangelo. I'm the executive director of CNY Fair Housing. I'm joined by my colleague, Alex Lawson, who is our housing policy manager. Just want a brief introduction to our organization and why we're here. So CNY Fair Housing works to not only eliminate housing discrimination, but to proactively promote housing opportunity. And we receive funding from HUD, from New York State, as well as from the city of Syracuse and other municipalities that we serve to help not only investigate complaints, but also provide technical assistance and policy research on housing issues, and particularly on the fair housing impacts of local decision making. We're actually right now working on fair housing assessment for the city of Syracuse and for Onondaga County. We're engaged in that process. It's once every 5 years. We're conducting it's called an analysis of impediments to fair housing choice, and where we not only identify barriers to housing choice, but also make recommendations. One of the recommendations we've always had in those fair housing assessments over the years since we've been doing them, which has been 25, 30 years that we've been around as an organization, is to increase tenant protections. We have supported good cause eviction protections, both at the state level and for the city of Syracuse and every municipality in our service area. New York State good cause eviction law allows municipalities to opt into tenant protections that will only allow eviction or a refusal to renew a lease under certain conditions. Good causes for eviction under the good cause eviction law would include the tenant violating the terms of the lease, the tenant failing to pay rent, the tenant damaging the property, the tenant causing a nuisance, the tenant using the property for illegal purposes, the tenant refusing access to the property to make repairs, the landlord wanting to live in the property or wanting a family member to live in the property, the landlord wanting to remove the property from the rental market, the landlord wanting to demolish the property, and the tenant refusing to reasonable changes to the terms of the lease at renewal. Were Syracuse to opt into good cause, a landlord could evict a tenant or refuse to renew their lease for any of these reasons. Simply put, good cause just allows good tenants to remain good tenants. These standards that are already already protect tenants from being evicted outright. Right now, a landlord who wants to get rid of a tenant by breaking their lease already has to provide a good reason in housing court. Good cause would simply extend these existing protections to cover non-renewal evictions, where the landlord attempts to remove a tenant at the end of their lease by refusing to renew it. Eviction by non-renewal has become increasingly common in Syracuse. The numbers have gone up significantly compared to evictions for non-payment. And landlords often keep tenants on month-to-month leases just so they can end at any time end that tenant's tenancy and remove them without the hassle of having to follow the protections, the regular protections that we have for tenants in place and those regular eviction procedures. Currently, landlords do not need to justify a decision not to renew a lease, and they are able to evict through non-renewal for all kinds of reasons that would not justify a normal eviction. We get hundreds of calls every year from tenants who are trying to understand their rights. They're trying to enforce their rights. And what we have found in our experience is that tenants are frequently facing non-renewals because they call codes, or tenants are afraid to call codes because they know that they're going to be non-renewed.
Sally, excuse me, that's retaliatory eviction, right?
Yes.
Well, that's already against the law, correct?
It is against the law, but proving that is
I'm
incredibly
asking her.
proving that is incredibly difficult.
Well, what's the difference with this particular thing? Why would that be easier?
Because they would not have to put in the renewal would be automatic. They couldn't simply non-renew the tenant's lease. The renewal would be automatic unless the tenant violated the lease.
Retaliatory eviction would remain the same, correct?
Alex can probably answer the specifics.
The difference is that currently you couldn't evict somebody retaliatorily. You'd have to provide a reason. But if you wanted to just non-renew at the end of a lease, you don't have to provide a reason.
So you're assuming that all non-renewals are retaliatory?
No.
No, and there
It
are
just happens if somebody reports a code violation and then the landlord decides to not renew the lease, you're saying that that's automatically a retaliatory eviction?
No, we are not. We're saying that the landlord would have to provide a reason, and if they had a legitimate reason, one of the ones that's outlined here, such as not complying with the lease, such as not paying, such as causing a nuisance, that's fine. But if they can't provide a reason, not a legal one, that could be a retaliatory
So the
eviction.
discernment is what's a legal reason and what isn't a reason.
That's correct.
we see other reasons why housing providers non-renew leases, including some directly related to fair housing and discriminatory treatment, such as tenants who request reasonable accommodations or modifications to their homes for a disability. We had a recent case where a tenant received a non-renewal. He was given a piece of plywood for a ramp, and when that plywood started to rot, his sister came and replaced the plywood, and they non-renewed his lease the next day. They just told him that they would not be renewing his lease. The tenant, and that is retaliatory, and we can pursue a case. That case will take several years to go through federal court. And in the meantime, that tenant is probably going to be out of their housing.
Well, out of the
Can I ask a
6,
question on
Sure.
that? Because, so did the tenant move in with these regulations?
So the tenant had moved into the property, but then they're, in part because they were desperate for a place to live. But then the property was repaved, and the sidewalks became inaccessible. And so the accessibility conditions at the property worsened, and so the tenant required a ramp to be able to get off of the curb because the landlord didn't put in the legally required curb cuts. So the tenant was making do with a piece of plywood, and even though they had requested that the landlord actually put in the proper modifications, so they were making do with the curb cut with the plywood. But when they went to replace it,
Isn't there also a a avenue that the tenant could have taken through his disability rights to go to whatever advocacy organizations to get a whatever ramp they needed?
Yes. So the tenant did that, but when the landlords don't comply, and in this case, the landlord doesn't comply, then a case has to be brought, and those cases can take years. We have currently a case around a reasonable, about parking spaces that has been in court for 4 years. Our tenants, and this is at a senior housing, where actually our tenants are, our tenants are actually passing away before some of those cases are resolved, because the process does take a long time. Right now, HUD and the New York State Division of Human Rights are years behind in investigating complaints. So there is a reactive measure that we can take, but in the meantime, people suffer through that process and don't have access to the housing that they need. Other examples, when tenants have experienced domestic violence. Tenants calling an ambulance for emergency medical care, or tenants becoming pregnant, and housing providers deciding they don't want children being in the property. Again, many of these are discriminatory reasons, but being able to prove those is a long process and can be challenging. These are actual reasons local landlords in our service area have attempted to remove tenants from a unit through non-renewals. And while they are not legal grounds for eviction, as the law currently stands, a landlord does not need a good reason to non-renew. They don't need any reason to non-renew. Time and again, our clients are being forced out of their homes for clearly discriminatory reasons. But
Do you pursue that? I mean, do you?
Yeah, we do pursue that.
How many court cases do you have regarding that?
Reasonable accommodation cases specifically, or we have about, if you include all the clients, probably about 30 or so, 35 cases that are currently pending. But again, those cases take up to 4 or 5 years in federal court, or they take our cases right now, if we file with the New York State Division of Human Rights, it's about a 2-year process to get a resolution.
So these are 30 cases of non-renewal?
No, these are a variety of fair housing cases, the majority of which are disability related.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. You didn't answer the question. How many of them were non-renewal? They were like asked to leave because of non-renewal?
So I'd have to look at the specifics of those cases. A lot of the complaints we receive related to non-renewals don't become fair housing complaints. A lot of times what we end up having to do is just advise folks we often advise them on how to find other housing. We advise them on how to become homeless, because that's often their only recourse, because it's so hard to find housing right now. So that is often what we're able to do is counsel them to be able to have enough evidence to put together a fair housing complaint that could be taken to court or to the State Division of Human Rights or to HUD. Requires a lot of additional direct evidence of discrimination. We do testing, undercover testing, to try to verify what's happening. But again, it's a really long process to be able to do that and to be able to put together a rigorous case. And then the process, once it even goes to court, takes a long time. So
just to add to that, the problem is that there's not enough evidence, and there's no evidence because non-renewals don't require a stated reason for non-renewal. It's very similar. We have a similar problem currently.
So you're asking us to vote on speculative issue. I mean, you're saying there's no evidence.
There's no documented evidence. I think
Well, isn't that important? I mean, when we consider legislation, that's sort of important.
These are real cases.
Well,
yeah.
you just said that you just said that they weren't.
No.
These are real instances of
speculating
current
on that.
clients. I'd say there's a similar problem right now as the housing market is heated up, in that it is very difficult to prove discrimination currently, because it's not a situation where a landlord has a unit available for a long time, no one's asking for it, and they deny someone, like they're only applicants for a while, and we can sort of put together a pattern of evidence and say, okay, it's probably because of this protected characteristic, and do testing and evidence that way. Currently, because units spend so little time in the market, it's full. And there's no question of, well, what was the reasoning behind it? Because the landlord has the opportunity to fill it immediately and not have to display the full behavior that is discriminatory.
So just a quick question in regard to the 30 cases. How many of them specifically are in the city out of those pending cases in the fair housing
How many of them are in
the city?
in
Do
the
we know?
city? I don't know the number offhand. We have a large service area, but we do beyond our fair housing. Those are the cases that we have legal complaints for. We also do about 60 cases a year that we mediate, where we do advocacy and mediation on behalf of tenants. And then in addition to that, we do another 400 or 500 cases a year in which we do investigations and counseling. So of that total number, about I just looked at our numbers the other day. We had it's about 1/4 of our total cases out of 14 counties. 1/4 of our cases are in the city of Syracuse. So 97 for fair housing services, and then 97 for counseling. So almost 200 total.
Is there, Sally, is there a good model in the state of New York? And I know that the law just recently was passed, but is there a good model where you can abstract data from there for our own consumption as a city? Is there any good model or law that has been initiated in the state of New York? Or for that matter, neighboring states?
The state law just passed this summer, and the 6 municipalities that have opted in have all done it in the last couple of months. There isn't a lot of data from them on evictions and changes in evictions. We know that the state of New Jersey has had stronger versions of these protections for 40 years, and they have better outcomes in terms of integration across the state, in terms of fair housing. We also know what data we do have is that evictions are high. They were very low for a couple years when it wasn't legal to pursue them, but they have bumped right back up. And we also know that the types of evictions that are occurring in Syracuse City Housing Court have changed since before the pandemic. Pre-pandemic, about 90% of evictions were based on non-payment. That was, the landlord's trying to get their money back, there's non-payment. That has dropped to 75%. There are now holdover cases where the landlord just wants the tenant out. And it's not very hard to explain this. The rents are rising so fast in Syracuse that landlords have an interest in being able to switch the unit over to someone who could pay more.
Well, not only rents are rising, also costs to maintain units are also rising. So there could be an equivalent there.
And this won't be a speculative number, but I know many of my colleagues and myself, during the eviction moratorium, we got sometimes sarcastically asked by many landlords about, are you going to cut my taxes? Because nobody's paying me. That eviction moratorium put that whole subset of people who invest in the city, who have invested in the city for years, under the gun as far as paying taxes go. They lost thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars.
Luckily for the situation you're talking about, the eviction moratorium is over, and this has nothing to do with
Well,
good
no, it has
cause.
something to do.
What is it?
They were eviction moratorium, and like the state does all the time, they foist all this on local lawmakers like us. They make up these laws and then expect us to work them out and be able to communicate effectively with the people we represent. Of
And
the
currently, there's
1,600
also still
there were
protections in
1,600
place from the
eviction
moratorium.
notices. There were 1,600 eviction notices last year. 1,000 people were evicted last year. How many of them you think fall outside of what you just mentioned as far as good cause eviction goes? Did any of them? Because the judge has ruled on them all.
Well, it's non-renewals. It's not necessarily evictions.
But that's the thing. You're considering non-renewal of a lease an eviction. It isn't. It's a non-renewal of a lease.
It effectively is an eviction. If you want to stay in your home and you've been paying your rent and you've been a good tenant all along and you want to stay in that home, being forced to leave sure feels like an eviction.
I know it's
whether it's called a non-renewal or it's and whether it goes to court as a holdover. The fact is that is what is making people homeless in our
The
community.
fact is, I know dozens of landlords, and many landlords, they keep tenants who are good, a lot of times below market rent. because they pay them all the time, and they keep the properties up.
And this law doesn't change that. This law does not change that. There is nothing that would, that,
It infringes on a person's right to run their property,
But-
the property they own.
I mean, you could say that about any protections that exist to protect the rights of tenants. I mean, the reality is we need protections for individuals who don't own their own properties because people need a place to live. And so, I mean, you could argue that having basic codes enforcement
See, my
infringes on
contention
someone's
is
right.
Our housing crisis, we need to build more housing, and we're all involved in that. That's what we're doing, the Housing Strategy Corporation and everything else. We're trying to garner funds. But the folks that have been investing in these neighborhoods for years and years, adding value to all those neighborhoods, keeping their houses up and all that, I think we got to be cognizant of what they went through during the eviction moratorium and what they're going through right now.
Well, I want to address the question about costs increasing, because good cause does allow a rent increase of 5% plus inflation, or 10% total if the inflation is higher than 5%. So it does allow to accommodate those cost increases, up to 10%. So it does address the potential increases in cost, and fortunately, the building costs are stabilizing a little bit right now. It was challenging during COVID with supply limitations, but it does allow for those cost increases to address increased cost of maintenance.
I'll also add to that is what's allowed without any scrutiny. A landlord could raise the rent to any amount, and then they would just need to explain to the judge if the tenant that wasn't paying it and they tried to evict for non-payment, explain why they had raised the rent to that amount. And they're supposed to take into account things like increased property taxes, increased utility bills, the cost of increased maintenance, or if you've made major renovations as well.
Sally, what about if a landlord needs their property back to either live in it themselves, or maybe a family member, or something of the sort? Would that be?
That would, a landlord would be able to non-renew or evict the tenant if they wanted to live in the property, or if their family member wanted to live in the property.
Okay.
I want to make I have a question pertaining to landlords. So when a tenant is breaking that lease, decides I'm not going to pay rent, has a friend who goes in there, doesn't belong there, and they're dealing with drugs, that's a violation of the lease. The landlord cannot just say, I'm taking you to court. They have to wait 5 months. They have a long, long process. Now, I even know a story where a landlord told me someone broke into her apartment and it was a squatter. She had a court order. You know what police officer told her? If you let them out, you're going to be arrested. You're the one that's going to be in trouble. So that kind of, it scares me. But then we have a lot of tenants in our community, and they're living in places like Villa Scalabrini, other places where there's a lot of violations. And their rights are not being heard by anyone. They're passing the buck. No one's speaking on behalf of the tenant who called me and says they're smoking at Villa Scalabrini, they're doing drugs at Villa Scalabrini, it's going to one ear out the other. And Colts has been in there. No one's fighting for their rights either. All right, we talk a lot about the tenants and the landlord, but the tenants still live in this public housing. Apparently they have no rights, and their voices are not being heard at all, whether it's here, Villa Scalabrini, Vanette Towers, or any other housing that's going on. But I want to go back, there are two sides. I felt sorry for a landlord that lost, $5,000. Tenants said, I don't want to be here anymore, and destroyed that property, destroyed his apartment. Now, where does it put him? Now it puts him in a hole. Now he's going to be forced, he's got to pay for it out of his own pocket, and now he's going to have to raise the rent. I mean, there's two sides of the story. When I look and I see tenants' rights, which is good, but when I look something for landlord rights, I see nothing. So there's both sides of the issue, and I think it should be heard. Thank you.
Sally, can you give me an example? So I guess, first of all, to what Councilor Hogan said, I feel the same way about sometimes when we get state law passed and we kind of become guinea pigs, right? We're going to end up with this Swiss cheese of a state where some municipalities are 1 unit, some municipalities are 10 units. that's going to look a little odd. And I would guess that the legislature, not speaking for them, will eventually have to go back and revisit this thing and try to make it clear statewide. But I think what my concern is, and the reason we've planned to have so many committee meetings is because I'm sitting here with an open mind, right? I am a landlord, full disclosure, have been for years. I'm not going to get hit because I take care of my house. I vet my tenants. I know who's moving in. Sometimes you get burned. Most of the time you don't if you do all of that. What I get concerned about is we have pockets of this city in certain neighborhoods where there are people moving into these houses that are dilapidated, a housing stock that by all means is failing in a lot of these neighborhoods, right? I could take you for a ride and say, I don't need to show you, right? So we move these tenants into these buildings with landlords that live in the Bronx and haven't been to Syracuse or couldn't smell Syracuse if they drove past it, right? They move these tenants in. The tenants call code violations 5 times in the first month because there are roaches and a furnace that doesn't work and windows falling out of the building. And instead of going and fixing that house on East Division Street, let's just pick on a street, instead of going and fixing it, they throw them out and they end up homeless in a car with a dead kid in the back of Grant Village, right? And the next person is so desperate for housing, whether they are from, Sudan or whether they just moved here from Philadelphia, they're desperate to find housing in Syracuse for some reason, and they move in and the process starts again. They call code violations, the landlord doesn't fix it, they go in, they Band-Aid the furnace, they Band-Aid the windows, and that person calls, and next thing you know, they're out again. The next person, and now the rent's $100 higher because I have 10 people waiting for this apartment. So, sorry for my rambling, but in that situation, are you seeing that? And what happens now without good cause eviction? What do they do to try to rectify this? Do you have any grounds at all to try to help those people? Or to actually push that landlord to say, we know what you did?
Well, I think one is there is a lot of tenants who aren't even making that call to code enforcement. There are so many tenants who are just living in fear because they don't have anywhere else to go. We met with a senior group at SNCC a few weeks ago as part of our outreach for the city's fair housing assessment. And we talked to them about, what are your housing conditions and what's going on and what are your concerns? And this one resident was talking about the codes issues at her apartment. And so we recommended she called codes and she said, no way. She's like, I'm afraid I'm going to be out. And so she continues to live in her apartment on the north side where she is facing issues, backups, and all these issues in her apartment, but she won't call codes because she is on a month-to-month lease and she knows that she would not be able to find another place because there would not need to be a reason and for her to not be renewed. And there's not a lot you can say to folks. You can tell them that, well, it's illegal. Retaliatory eviction is illegal, but it's a non-renewal. They don't need a reason. And to be able to prove that suddenly this non-renewal is because of the fact that she tried to enforce her rights is really challenging. So there's not a lot that you can say to folks, to be honest. And you make sure they know how to call 211 and how to access shelter. You make sure they know about their right to request a reasonable accommodation if the shelter isn't going to work for them or for disability-related reasons, which is what we often focus on in our work. But there isn't a lot of other recourse for folks for those non-renewals. And that is, again, an increasing number of the cases we're seeing that are going into court, into our courts.
I think for me, on the spectrum of what is a landlord, that's a very big spectrum, right? We have people that own a 2-family house next door to them, and they're renting it, trying to better their street. And then on the other side of that, we have something like Skyline, right? Those are worlds apart from each other, and we have to understand that. I know a lot of good landlords. There's some sitting in this room right now that are absolutely not going to let their houses in Eastwood fall apart, right? They're not. It's not in their best interest. They understand. But I also know a lot of places where there are landlords that have not stepped foot in this city in 2 years, and they don't care what those houses look like. And we've got to figure out a way. We can't just keep putting Band-Aids all over these houses. We have to figure something out. I don't know if this is it, but I'm sitting here with an open mind. I'm certainly not sitting here thinking you're lying to us because you've got no reason to. So thank you for being here.
Also, the problem we have is what LLCs. As a counselor, I've sent numerous letters to these LLCs that they're out in Texas, New York, Louisiana, and they hire someone. I had a situation, someone on Oak Street. She rented the house, she saw it on Willow, and it was a disaster. I fought to try to get her rent back. Here was the problem. She signed a lease. You have to look at it. And this is a common problem. It's rat infested. But they've got too many LLCs. And we have to say, let the buyer beware. And don't sign long-term leases if you can.
Well,
it's terrible.
And the reality is the LLCs are not just in places like Texas and New York. The LLCs are in places like Fayetteville and
Oh, yes,
Cicero.
you're right.
And they're also in places like this in the city neighborhoods.
Yeah.
We recently researched, exactly, tracked single property LLCs, and for all the properties in the city of Syracuse to identify how many single property LLCs and where they were held. We found, oftentimes what we consider to be a smaller landlord might actually have, 80-some single property LLCs that are all getting mailed to their address. So we need to hold all those landlords accountable and make sure that that we're finding a way to do that.
Good Causes also provides a new tool for taking on LLCs because there's this whole thing about how big is your portfolio if you can actually evict. And so the way that it's written, LLCs have to disclose all natural persons who are associated with the LLC, mailing addresses for them, and the other property they own if they want to evict. That's part of the eviction filings. They have to provide that information. And so, Syracuse has tried for a long time to get a handle on who's owning property in the city. And a lot of the things that the city has tried haven't had the teeth for it, but if LLCs all of a sudden can't evict unless they're disclosing who they are, that's an option.
But that's not particularly with good cause. I think that has been entered into law about the LLCs, period, throughout the state, period. Also, because the word good tenant keeps coming up, and just this particular law doesn't supersede the laws that are already in place. And much of the laws that the protections that are in this law are already in place, outside of the lease renewal and one other. But as far as like the current New York State, like a 10-day cure, if the tenant is in violations and they get a 10-day to cure and they don't, is that now not a good tenant? They could have particularly been a good tenant, but they haven't done something in that currently allows them to forfeit the property. So again, this is things that this law doesn't supersede certain things. So what happens with something like that?
So that tenant would still be, like, if they're violating the lease and they fail to cure, they can, an eviction proceeding could be brought against them with good cause in place or not. So it wouldn't change that at all. I think the reality is, right, you do have a lot of folks who that fall on hard times and struggle at times, and then they get back on their feet, and then, they're back to being a more stable tenant, which is maybe a better way to think about it. And so this affords people stability as well. And I think that's important when you are living with the uncertainty of whether you can stay in your home, which a lot of our tenants are. Then I think this can help afford people stability of knowing that they're going to be able to stay in their home, and not be out on a whim or because they've tried to enforce their rights.
Sally, now, with this law, what do you think it would do to the process, especially how long it takes to resolve a case?
Well, I know, some of the folks in legal services that are in eviction court every day have said that this would actually help improve the eviction process because it would reduce the number of those non-renewal evictions, and a landlord would have to, it almost normalize the process. So there's one process for evicting tenants, and that is if they're a bad tenant. And so it would free up, it could potentially free up the courts for those cases where a landlord is bringing an eviction for a tenant because of a lease violation.
And that's because there's kind of a glaring hole in this thing, right? So if we're giving them 12 options of why to, if I need an option, a reason to evict, I pick one of the 12, right? So instead of saying, I don't like you, I say, I'm taking it off the market. And then what happens? Are we going to be in a position where we're forced to track whether that person actually takes it off the market or not? Because I can tell you, we have 50% of the rentals in the city on the rental registry. The other 50% won't comply, thinking that we or NBD has enough staff to go out and chase who is saying what and putting it on the market and taking it off the market. That's simply not going to happen. No offense to NBD. But it's just, that's a
Which is why I
work
asked the
power
question.
thing, right? I mean,
The enforcement of it wouldn't be through NBD. The person bringing the eviction, if that was the reason they were going to use, they would need to show evidence in court that they were actually intending to do that. Same for the demolition. You might have to have, either show that you've begun the process of looking into demolition, that kind of a thing. But it wouldn't be up to NBD to say, this decision was made, this eviction happened, and now we need to look into it, because that's not feasible, obviously. So it's going to be up to the judge.
I think because there's 12 reasons, this is my gut. I think what ends up happening is this law gets applied here with the most egregious cases versus just your average eviction for a reason, right? So if I want to get you out of my house and I say I'm taking it off the market, you're probably not going to sue me for that, because you're going to have to prove that that's not true, and I'm not going to let it sit 3 months, blah, blah, blah. I think the really egregious ones where it's retaliatory, this probably helps those people out.
You were also mentioning just a minute ago the month-to-month agreements, lease agreements. So sometimes the renter agrees to do that because they know they're moving into a difficult situation and they don't want to be stuck with a one-year lease. However, on the other end, the landlords do the month-to-month so that they have more ability to then not renew, I'm sure. So will this new legislation address some of that, or in any way?
So for tenants, they could still choose not to renew their lease, and with proper notice, right? They still would have to give 30 days notice from the date of the next rent payment. So they would have to, or whatever is in, if they had a lease, if they did have a lease agreement, it would have to be in what's in the lease agreement. But they would still have to give the proper notice for tenants, so they would still have some flexibility. But it would create an automatically renewing lease for the tenant. So the lease would renew for the tenant automatically, unless they, of course, violated the lease.
Sally, where you stand on the units? Ithaca and Albany went down to, I believe, 1 unit. Where do you stand? Did you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, I think
Which would be just somebody leaves somebody a house, and all of a sudden they decide to rent it out.
I think if we agree that the single property LLCs, I agree with the 1 unit. I think modeling it after what other communities have done, Albany, Ithaca, the other communities have done, I think is a good idea.
So my question to you, if Albany, and I'm a longtime city councilor, if Albany and Ithaca are doing it right now, why wouldn't we, if being judicious, why wouldn't we wait to see how it works out there? Because what I believe is going to happen is this is going to be, if we pass this, this is going to disturb the idea of investing in Syracuse quite a bit.
Because
our housing strategy, we have about $7.5 million in our Housing Strategy Corporation. And in reality, we're going to need private investment to spur the housing market. And I think people say, why do I have to go into Syracuse? I can go into Salina, I can go to Camillus, I can go to Marcellus, I can go anywhere and invest. I can put my extra $20,000 improving my house in Salina instead of on Tipperary Hill.
We have a homelessness crisis right now. People need help right now. We have skyrocketing family homelessness. It is, and actually family homelessness is now surpassing individual homelessness. So sitting and waiting means more people living in shelters. It means more kids living in shelters. It means more hotels. And that's where a very large percentage of our population is living right now. The point in time count for the Housing and Homeless Coalition this year showed just record numbers, both sheltered and unsheltered homeless. And people are desperate right now to stay in their housing.
All those folks, God bless them all. And that's why we're trying to build more housing. I mean, we know that. We know all this. We know there's 2,000 unhoused individuals in this, or maybe it's 3,000 now. We know a lot of them are kids. But I think this is going to exacerbate that quite a bit. Because I think landlords, when they remodel their places, they're going to leave units unrented until somebody passes like an FBI check to get in there.
I mean, I can't believe a landlord would leave a unit unrented for that long and forego the rent.
Our community has many properties that are unrented. Y'all should look into them.
So I forgot the point.
In terms of
If
investment in the
there's
city.
a tenant on Wall Street, say there's a tenant on Wall Street, and they get unjustly evicted. They fight it, and they win. They're still in the same deplorable conditions, correct? They're still in the same unit they've been in. Everybody on this council knows the bad landlords. I know a ton of bad landlords, but it's a minuscule amount compared to what we face as far as sometimes tenants in our neighborhoods that destabilize the neighborhoods.
But right now, the tenants are afraid to call codes. So this would actually allow for...
Now, I mean, how many, is that documented? To me, the people that call me about bad properties, they call me all the time, and I hand them over to codes.
They're having a successful resolution?
A lot of them do. The codes hit them, yeah. Our codes department is doing the best they can out there.
No, my concern is the folks we hear from who aren't calling codes because they are afraid they're going to lose their right to be in that home. They're afraid they're going to lose their ability. And I agree with you, we need to build more housing. I don't know that you'll find a stronger advocate for building more housing. But the reality is we need to keep people in the housing that we have and make sure that they're able to remain and enforce their rights to have good quality housing. And we're completely failing at that right now.
I'll also say that one of the exemptions for good cause is new construction. Anything that's built since 2009 is exempted. Anything that's built new going forward is exempted for 30 years, which is, the term of the loan.
That's a great point, but that new construction happens and maybe they decide not to rent that place for a while.
And can I just ask why I don't have the background to that particular piece of the law? Why since 2009? I don't think that a house built in 2009 is still shining in, so.
It's trying to address the exact point that Councilor Hogan is talking about, the getting financing, making sure that you can get a loan to build a new thing, and recognizing people who have built recently are probably in a situation where they made the economic decision to build new, not recognizing that this law might be in effect. So it's sort of a safe harbor for those recently constructed buildings, and then going forward, a 30-year.
So I purchased an older home with a mortgage as a rental property, and I have to have a home improvement loan to fix it up. That doesn't count for me.
It would not, no.
So, yeah, that doesn't.
How are we helping tenants in situations? I have one in particular on Catherine Street. She's renting her home from Housing Visions. She's afraid to call the police. She sees drugs and prostitution. What are we doing to helping the tenants who are living in these situations? I'm going to answer this. Who are afraid to call the police. What are we doing on that?
I'm not going to tell you what we are doing, which is, we're counseling folks on their rights and making sure we're referring them to our partners in the community and to address those issues. We focus a lot on research and policy changes to improve, conditions in the neighborhoods. our office is across the street from Villa Scalabrini and next
Right.
door to Skyline, and the corner of Willow and Catherine. So certainly the
Eviction
issues
is
you're
over there,
raising are well known to us. But what we do is we are working to address those. We have and to counsel people the best you can on the rights that they have. But the real concern is just the general housing stability that folks are suffering from.
Right, and they can't afford to go from apartment to an apartment. Sometimes they have to live in these conditions. And I'm not talking about living inside the house, but around the house, outside the house, where they feel threatened.
I guess just flipping the story a little bit. What, from fair housing side, what do you do to empower, especially the landlords that are dealing with bad tenants, and they may not have resources to evict those tenants? Where do we help them?
Well, I mean, we are, tend to focus on the tenant side of things. That is what we do, and our mission. And we do a lot of education for landlords, though. We do a lot of training and regularly provide landlords training on the law and how to remain in compliance with fair housing laws, but still address the needs of their business as well. But it is a business, right? And it's a choice to be in that business as opposed to having a choice to have a roof over your head.
You mean a choice to invest in the neighborhood. Invest in the neighborhood, add value to the neighborhood, plus make some money.
Sometimes.
Potentially.
Sometimes.
And they can
Sometimes they're
go,
there to
and now they
invest.
can go anywhere.
Sometimes they're there to invest in the neighborhood. Sometimes they're there to suck every bit of dollars they can get out of a house and then leave it to rot.
There's a few of them.
There's
around.
more than the few.
Well, I
drive-
tell you,
let me-
everybody in here is a good landlord.
Let me take you on a ride.
Well, I don't need a ride. I've been around a lot longer than you have. I don't need a ride. I walk those streets too.
Can I ask a data matter as well? So for those who do have courage to go to the court, tenant that is, to go to the court and fight and for say unjust eviction, what's the success rate for those individuals? And you have said earlier that it take about 4 years before it take a long time to really go through the court process and to really get to a resolution. What is the success of those individuals that have actually had courage to want to go that far because of unjust eviction?
If you're talking about eviction specifically, that's not 4 years. That's 4 years for fair housing complaints or maybe longer. Evictions is a lot faster. And in general, evictions for non-payment have about a 50% success rate in the Syracuse city courts.
50%?
50%. Evictions, holdover evictions, have a much higher success rate, closer to 66%. And that's kind of what we're talking about here, where there's been this shift where it used to be that the vast majority, 90% of the evictions were for non-payment, and that's the landlord is asserting that the tenant's not paying, and they want to get their back rent out of the proceedings. That's shifting. It's still a majority, but it's a much smaller majority, and now it's a lot more holdovers where it's anything except for non-payment. It could be lease violations. It could be I non-renewed and I want this person to leave.
So it's 90 days?
90 days.
Is that the average?
I do not know the average. We don't do evictions.
Oh, you don't do evictions?
We don't do eviction court, no.
Okay. Do you have any stats on it, or?
On the number of days?
No, and the number of days it takes to evict somebody? Because I've heard all sorts of different figures. I've heard a lot higher than 90 days.
I think
too.
you guys should have Mary Trainer here to talk about you, and she can tell you that stuff. She's the expert on that. We're the expert on fair housing, but she's the expert on the process of
So
going
I've been
through that.
I've been
Or
quiet
judge.
here today, Counselor, and our guests. And one of the things that I continue to think about is the concept of efficiency. We hear landlords talking about the inefficiency of the process. We hear tenants' rights groups talking about inefficiency of the process. And I heard you made a comment around how this may or may not help. Should be aware that's something that I'm considering. The other is talking about and thinking about the issue systemically. We can have anecdotes on, from individuals that are representing tenants, and we can have anecdotes from the landlords, and both of them are compelling, right? There are cases that emotionally tug at the heartstrings on both sides. My lens and my background is in education. I work in the city schools, and numbers that I know that I can give you, as a fact. Last year, we had 2,103 students qualify for protections under the McKinney-Vento Act, which is a federal act that protects our homeless students. 2,103. Out of a 19,000-person district, that is 11%, greater than 11% of our student population was homeless at some point during the year last year. If we don't talk about homelessness, we talk about housing stability. And more than a quarter of our students lived at multiple addresses during the academic year last year. Do you know of any information? Do you have any stats? Do you have anything to support educational outcomes or maybe societal outcomes, whether it be health, mental health, incarceration? Do you have any information that talks in particular about students, youth, and housing stability?
I'm trying to recall back to the city's great, the housing instability study that was done a couple of years ago on those and the facts, and certainly can follow up with you regarding those. The homeless numbers in our city school districts is it's shocking, and the fact that 11%. That's in many classrooms. That's several children in a classroom who are facing homelessness or are homeless at the time. But certainly happy to follow up with you regarding the educational outcomes, and housing instability.
I wanted to add just a little something to that for the number of homeless families are not all due to landlords or evictions. Some may have resulted in evictions, but more or less it's the availability of homes or units that adequately fit the family size. We have a extreme shortage of properties that are 3 bedrooms or more, and a lot of these families are in need of those larger units. So for everyone who's developing 1s and 2s, that's the big push. That is what we do not need. I've said it over and over again. Families cannot squeeze into a 1 and 2 bedroom. So that's also a part of why we have a larger amount of families that are facing homelessness. They don't have the unit size that they need. But I wanted to go back to the talks about the 90-day evictions. I guess we would probably need to address that a little bit more in the next one, because one, with the moratorium protections that carried over after the moratorium, there's like a layering of different time frames of when tenants can, once paperwork is filed, that the judges are able to say you can stay here an additional 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, and then we come back and revisit that. So, and that's ongoing. It's, you come back and revisit. So there is no set 90-day parameter for any of that. It's longer than a lot of landlords would like to have happening if it's particularly a bad tenant. And I guess that is the word that's being tossed around, good tenant, bad tenant. So it's a slippery slope.
I mean, certainly the Tenant Protection Act extended the process to help provide stability for tenants. And that was the goal, and it has done that, and it's extended the eviction process. I know, that's what a lot of the pushback is from landlords now, is the results of that. But, the goal is to just keep people housed, to keep families housed. And so, if you believe that's a good goal,
but
then
that's where I'm saying, like, this law does not supersede any of this older stuff. So it's just an added layer. But what's wrong over here? what's wrong with the, outside of you saying retaliatory evictions, which are already law, and then the renewal of leases, that would be the real only thing that is a super change. But outside of that, everything else is already in place, and what's broken over here?
I think that's exactly right, is that Syracuse has a gigantic housing crisis, and there's many things that need to happen about that. And we've been involved, CMY Fair Housing has, with a bunch of different stuff. We've talked to the council before about the zoning changes. We were involved in the housing strategy. There's so many ways to get at it. But what this law does specifically is it extends existing protections to non-renewals. And that's not going to fix everything, but it's going to fix the exact problems that we're seeing, which is basically when someone calls us and says, I suspect that my rights are being violated and being discriminated against. One of the very first questions we ask is, when is your lease up? Because that tells us how much time we have to work with it. Because if the lease isn't up, you can't just evict somebody for no reason. You got time. And so if we have 11 months till your lease is being renewed, that's a lot of time to gather evidence. If the lease is up in 2 months and the landlord knows that we're involved, they can non-renew and not provide a reason at all. So that's the kind of situation we're talking about specifically. And that's really all this law would do. It's not going to drastically reshape the Syracuse housing market, but it would solve that problem.
And correct me if I'm wrong, the retaliation eviction protection is only 12 months.
Yes.
I mean, I think it's important for me to say I am the last person who will ever villainize all landlords, because most landlords are not abusing tenants. That's the truth. Most landlords are actually behaving themselves, taking care of their tenants. They want their houses to be their retirement. They want their investments to actually make them money. It's not the most, right? Those good landlords that are in neighborhoods, they want the bad actors to be stopped, right? I can look out in this crowd right now and pick out a landlord and say, what rips apart the neighborhood the most? And they will tell you it's the other ones that are not doing what I'm doing. It's the ones that are not in Eastwood, as I stare at Joan Astry looking at me in the face. They're actually investing in my neighborhood and saying, we're going to take care of our houses, we're going to take care of our rental properties, we're going to make sure that we have snow removal, and we're going to make sure the siding's not falling off, and I can keep going. What happens when someone moves next door and actually is one of those abusive ones that is just looking to suck that equity out of there as fast as they can? So I love landlords, right? Myself included, and Patrona, the other people that own properties that are trying to do right by their neighborhood. But the last thing I want in my neighborhood is the bad actors. So we all can agree on that, I guarantee it.
Right, and this doesn't, again, yes, we're talking about bad tenants and then also, bad landlords. This does not change the ability to remove bad tenants in any way. It does not impact that ability in any way.
It's almost impossible sometimes to remove a bad tenant. I know I sit in neighborhood watch, maybe you should come to some of the neighborhood watch meetings I sit in. And they can continually complain about a landlord not evicting. Like on Park Avenue, I have a guy raising pit bulls in the second floor apartment. We've been trying to get him out for 6 months. I mean, it's like this happens. What Jimmy's point, there might be some landlords that destabilize neighborhoods, but there's some tenants, a lot of tenants that do. I hear it. I'll invite you both to any neighborhood watch me. I'm sure Councilor Nave or Councilor Jones-Rouser will invite you too.
And I invite you to.
And you can talk. And you can talk about. We can talk this all out.
And certainly, and also welcome anyone to. I'm going to have to get the tenant's permission to listen in on the calls when we're advising folks on what rights they have and frankly what rights they don't have, because that is what we're doing every day, and I can tell you the people that are calling us are in crisis, and we're trying to find ways to help them and just keep them in their homes.
Yeah, and as we approach 3:30, I actually think that's a good segue to adjournment. Is people inviting other people to continue the conversation. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning, this will be the first of many conversations related to good cause eviction. I thank our guests from CNY Fair Housing. And with that, I'll ask for a motion to adjourn.
Motion.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Corey. Sure. Thank you. Very good.
We'll start to reach out, Don.
Yeah.
Thank you, though. You're on the
You
list.
can always email everybody.
Yep, you can reach out to anyone up here.
Good job. Good first meeting. Good job.
Joe, All right.